Compared to the weighty task of biblical exegesis and the adrenaline rush of delivery, illustrating the sermon might seem fairly insignificant. It's tempting to treat sermon illustrations as if they were merely the wallpaper of the sermon, ornamental and comfortable, but relatively insignificant. In his book, Using Illustrations to Preach with Power, Dr. Brian Chappell points out that illustrations are not merely supplemental to good exposition, they are actually a form of exposition. According to Chappell, illustrations explain biblical truth to the emotions and to the will and exegete Scripture in terms of human experience. Illustrations can be used at nearly every point in the sermon and serve multiple purposes. For example, the sermon can begin with an illustration that raises the need and puts a face on the problem for the listener. The sermon may conclude with an illustration that is designed to move listeners to act upon what they've heard. Or you may want to use an illustration as an analogy to explain a complex point from the text. In his book, Biblical Preaching, Dr. Haddon Robinson notes that well-chosen, skillfully used illustrations can do just about everything: restate, explain, validate, or apply ideas by relating them to tangible experiences. In the broadest sense, illustrations can take many forms. They can be a story or a quote. The story could come from history, from today's news, or from your own experience. You might describe an event from biblical history. It might even be a poem or a statistical fact. With so many options to choose from, the first question you should ask is not which illustration you should use, but why you need an illustration and where. In order to select the right illustration, you need to know what purpose that illustration will serve. Is the goal to explain what is unknown by appealing to what is known? If so, then you'll need an analogy, an illustration that will enable you to point to one thing in order to explain another. Illustrations can also serve as examples. They can show what the biblical principle looks like when it is implemented. Brian Chappell notes that the primary purpose of illustrating is to motivate the listener.
One of the things I think it's important to say about illustrations, which is a little bit counterintuitive, is that I think the average person training for preaching approaches illustrations thinking their primary purpose is to clarify. Now, the implication, therefore, is if it's very clear, I don't need an illustration. And I think that's a great mistake. I think the primary purpose of illustrations is not to say they don't clarify, but the primary purpose of illustrations is not to clarify, but to motivate, to take and engage the will, the person, to say, not only do I understand that truth intellectually, but now I see it demonstrated in a real-life situation. I understand how it engages life so that I can act upon it. So if you see the dominoes falling of what I think is occurring in preaching, you have explanation that leads to demonstration that leads to application. Here's the truth. I explain it from the text. Then I demonstrate it. Here's an illustration. It shows you in real life how this truth engages our reality. And then I say, now that you know that, you need to apply it. So it becomes part of a real intellectual process of engaging the whole person in that scriptural truth.
One of the most effective kind of illustrations is a story, which provides an experiential dimension to the sermon.
Maybe it helps just to know maybe what preachers generally mean when they talk about illustrations. I think they're typically talking about small accounts or stories. And if you say that, it takes it away from being an allusion to a story or a recap of a story. It's re-engaging the person in that event. The language of the philosophers is that you want to have a lived-through experience. And I talk in some of the work that I've done about lived body detail. That you let people taste and smell and touch. You have description so that they are engaging their senses and their body and their emotions in that account. What I often find students do is they say, well, I referred to David and Goliath, but people didn't seem to be moved. And you can ask them, did you describe David leaning down and picking up the 5 smooth stones? What it would have felt like in his hand, how it would have weighed, what it sounded like going through the air. If that material is not part of the illustration, then you're really taking away from people the ability to engage the account. So to say, like a story, it has a beginning, it has an end, it has some plot, it has some development. Typically only runs a paragraph or maybe a little longer, but it has enough detail in it that it engages my imagination and pulls me in as a story does.
Illustrations are one of the ways the preacher builds a bridge from the biblical world to the contemporary context. In order to illustrate well, we need to pay attention to the culture around us.
Well, one of the things I think you try to do when you're a preacher is to listen to signals from the culture. And by signals, I mean small bits of information or insight that capture the way people are thinking. I think, for example, that if you just watch television, you can watch it and it can influence you and you're not even aware that you're being influenced. But one of the things I've had our students do is to copy down a number of the ads and ask yourself, what's the philosophy behind the ad? The people in Madison Avenue study their customer. So what is it they are assuming about the customer that will cause the customer to buy the car or to buy the candy or to buy the bottle of wine? If you can show that to people, that this is what is going on out there, sometimes that signal helps folks realize that what you're talking about is life as they experience it and life as it comes to them from the media of our time. So one of the things I do is I'm looking at ads in a magazine or stories to ask, what's the basic philosophy behind this? There's something about taking what is familiar and using it in an unfamiliar way that has a great impact on people. Mm-hmm. And I think many times we talk about the world, for example, and we end up talking about going to movies or dances and so forth. But the world is a system, and it's controlled by Satan, who has a very effective public relations campaign going. And to identify that this philosophy out there is the philosophy the Bible's speaking about that you need to be on guard against. I find that's one of the things I do when I read, when I watch, when I listen to conversations, and jot them down, and it's amazing how often they come back at me in a sermon.
Illustrations, then, are far more than ear candy for the sermon. It's not enough to have a good story. It needs to be the right kind of story, told for the right reason and in the right way. In a way, illustrating the sermon is really an extension of the preacher's exegetical work, because a good illustration links the text and the audience. In order to illustrate well, I need to understand both.